two corrupt officers spotted a black woman driving a luxury Mercedes and decided she was their next payday. They followed their usual routine: pull her over, plant the cocaine, and throw her in a cell, laughing as they destroyed her life. In their small town, they were the law, and they thought they were untouchable. But they made one fatal miscalculation. The woman in the back seat wasn't a helpless victim. She was Special Agent Jada Thompson, a top-tier DEA operative on a federal task force. And while they were celebrating their bust, she was recording every word. This is the story of how a routine frame-up turned into the ultimate courtroom nightmare. The rain in Cedar Grove didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Jada Thompson adjusted her grip on the steering wheel of the rental Mercedes C-Class. It was a nice car, confiscated from a mid-level distributor in Chicago. But it felt like a target. Jada wasn't Jada Thompson that night. To the criminal underworld of the region, she was Tasha Banks, a high-end logistics coordinator for a cartel moving product through the I-85 corridor. But to the two headlights approaching fast in her rearview mirror, she was something else entirely. Whoop! Whoop! The siren chirped, short and aggressive. Blue and red lights exploded against the rain-streaked darkness, blinding in their intensity. Jada sighed, checking her speedometer. She was doing the limit, her hands steady as stone as she moved them to the 10 and 2 position. She wasn't worried about the ticket. She was worried about the timeline. The buy was set for the next day at noon, and she couldn't afford a night in a drunk tank because some small-town deputy was bored. She pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching loudly. She lowered the window, letting the cold drizzle spray into the warm leather interior. In the side mirror, she saw them. Two silhouettes, one tall and lanky with a hitch in his step, the other broad, walking with the swagger of a man who owned the pavement he stepped on. Officer Roy Miller adjusted his belt as he approached the driver's side. He was a man of about 40, his face red and puffy with a mustache that had gone out of style years ago. His partner, a younger rookie named Officer Kyle Higgins, stood by the rear bumper, hand resting nervously on his holster. "License and registration," Miller said. No greeting, no good evening. Just a command barked through a jaw full of chewing tobacco. "Good evening, officer," Jada said, her voice calm and measured. She moved slowly. "My license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for it now." Miller shone his flashlight directly into her eyes. She didn't flinch. "Nice ride for a girl like you," Miller sneered, the beam of light dancing over the dashboard, then down to her legs, then back to her face. "What's a girl like you doing in a car like this in Cedar Grove?" "I'm passing through on business, Jada replied, handing over the ID she had been issued for this operation. It was a perfect forgery, backstopped by the federal government. Tasha Banks, DOB 1992, address Atlanta, Georgia. Miller snatched the card. He looked at it, then at her. He didn't check the registration. "Business?" Miller scoffed. He looked back at Higgins. "She says she's on business, Kyle. You believe that?" Higgins chuckled, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Don't look like no business car I ever saw, Roy." Miller leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and wintergreen dip. "Step out of the car now." "Officer, may I ask why?" Jada asked, keeping her hands visible. "I wasn't speeding. I haven't committed a traffic violation. I smell marijuana," Miller lied. It was effortless for him, a reflex. Jada didn't smoke. The car had been scrubbed clean by DEA forensics. It smelled of new car scent and lemon polish. "There is no marijuana in this vehicle, officer," Jada stated firmly. "I said step out of the vehicle," Miller shouted, his hand dropping to the handle of his baton. "Failure to comply. Get out." Jada calculated the odds. She could flash her badge now. She could say the magic words, "Federal agent, stand down." And this would be over. Miller would stutter, apologize, and let her go. But Jada Thompson wasn't just an agent. She was a hunter. And she had heard rumors about the Cedar Grove Police Department, rumors about money disappearing from evidence lockers, rumors about minority motorists being shaken down for cash on this stretch of highway. If she revealed herself now, they'd let her go. But they'd just pull over the next unsuspecting driver soon after. Let them dig, she thought. Let them dig their own graves. "Okay," Jada said. "I'm stepping out." She unbuckled and opened the door. The moment her foot touched the gravel, Miller grabbed her arm, spinning her around and slamming her chest first against the side of the Mercedes. "Hey!" Jada gasped, the cold metal biting into her cheek. "Stop resisting!" Miller yelled for the benefit of the dash cam, though she was standing perfectly still. He kicked her legs apart, patting her down aggressively, his hands lingering too long in places they shouldn't have been. "Cuff her, Kyle," Miller ordered, as Higgins clicked the handcuffs onto Jada's wrists, too tight, pinching the skin. Miller dove into the car. Jada watched over her shoulder, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She watched Miller tear through the glove box. She watched him rip up the floor mats. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. Miller's face grew redder. He popped the trunk. He threw her suitcase onto the wet road, unzipping it and tossing her clothes into the mud. Silk blouses, business suits, running gear. "You're..." all trampled under his boots. Still nothing. Miller stood up, breathing hard. He looked at Jada, hatred burning in his eyes. He had profiled her, stopped her, and manhandled her. If he didn't find something, he was looking at a lawsuit. He needed a win. He walked back to his patrol car. Jada saw him lean into the driver's side window of his cruiser. He fumbled with something in his vest pocket. When he returned to the Mercedes, his hand was clenched in a tight fist. He leaned into the back seat of her car. "Well, well, well," Miller announced loudly, his voice dripping with mock surprise. He pulled his hand out. In it was a clear plastic baggie filled with white powder. "Look what we have here, Kyle. Looks like Tasha here is riding with a little party favor." Higgins' eyes went wide. He knew, but he said nothing. He just nodded, complicit in his silence. "Good catch, Roy." Miller walked up to Jada, dangling the baggie in front of her face. "Cocaine, possession with intent to distribute, given the amount. You're looking at serious time, sweetheart." Jada looked at the bag. It was a sloppy plant. He hadn't even worn gloves when he pulled it from his pocket. His fingerprints would be all over it. "That's not mine," Jada said, her voice dropping an octave. Deadly calm. "And you know it." Miller laughed. It was a cruel, ugly sound. "It's in your car. That makes it yours. You people always say it's not yours." He grabbed her by the arm, dragging her towards the patrol car. He shoved her into the back seat, the hard plastic molding digging into her spine. "Read her the rights, Kyle," Miller said, sliding into the front seat and turning off the siren. "Not that it'll matter. Judge Bennett hates drug runners." As the cruiser pulled away, leaving her rental car abandoned on the side of the road with the door wide open, Jada stared at the back of Miller's head. She wasn't scared. She was recording. Every word they said, every lie they told was being etched into her memory. She shifted slightly, feeling the small, distinct lump of her wire sewn into the lining of her bra. Currently inactive but capable of localized recording, press against her skin. They thought they had caught a rabbit. They had no idea they had just caged a wolf. "Hey, Roy," Higgins whispered from the passenger seat. "You think she has cash on her?" "The car? It's expensive. We'll find out at the station." Miller grunted, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror. Whatever she has, it's civil forfeiture now. That's the Christmas bonus, Kyle. Jada closed her eyes and leaned her head back. Civil forfeiture. Christmas bonus. Keep talking, she thought. Please just keep talking. The Cedar Grove holding cell smelled of bleach and despair. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, flickering like a dying heartbeat. Jada sat on the thin steel bench, her hands still cuffed behind her back. They had left her there for a while. No water, no phone call. Miller had paraded her through the station like a trophy hunter, showing off a prize kill. He'd tossed the baggie of white powder onto the booking desk with a flourish. The desk sergeant, a tired-looking man, had barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. He'd seen it before, in Cedar Grove. Justice was a flexible concept, bent to fit the whims of whoever wore the badge. Finally, the heavy metal door creaked open. Miller walked in, a smirk plastered on his face, holding a clipboard. He was followed by a woman in a cheap suit. Court-appointed defense, Jada guessed. "This is Ms. Lawson," Miller said, gesturing to the woman. "She's here to tell you how screwed you are." Ms. Lawson looked exhausted. She sat on the chair opposite the cell, not even looking Jada in the eye. "Miss Banks, Officer Miller tells me they found cocaine in your vehicle. That's a Class A felony in this county. With Judge Bennett, you're looking at a mandatory minimum." "I didn't have any drugs," Jada said clearly. "Officer Miller planted them." Miller chuckled, leaning against the bars. "That's what they all say. You got video? You got witnesses?" "No, it's my word against yours. And around here, my word is gospel." Ms. Lawson sighed, finally looking up. "Look, Miss Banks, here's the deal. They're willing to drop it to possession if you plead out right now. Probation, a fine, and you forfeit the vehicle and any cash seized." "I had emergency cash in my purse," Jada said. "Evidence of drug proceeds," Miller interrupted quickly. "Seized under civil forfeiture, or we go to trial," Miller said, his voice dropping low, threatening. "And I make sure every charge sticks. Resisting arrest, assault on an officer, trafficking. You'll rot in state prison for a long time." Jada looked at Miller. She saw the arrogance, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He was a petty tyrant, a king of a kingdom made of dirt. "I want my phone call," Jada said. Miller rolled his eyes. "Fine. But if you're calling a lawyer, tell him to bring a shovel. You're already buried." He unlocked the cell door and uncuffed one of her hands, handing her the wall-mounted phone receiver. He stood close, invading her space. Listening, Jada dialed a number she knew by heart. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a bail bondsman. "Hello?" A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Uncle Frank," Jada said, her voice trembling slightly, a perfect performance of a scared niece. "It's Tasha. I'm in trouble. They arrested me. They said I had drugs. Uncle Frank, I didn't. You know I didn't." "I know, baby girl. Hold tight." The line went dead. Miller snatched the phone from her hand. "Uncle Frank, that your pimp?" He laughed, shoving her back onto the bench. "He ain't gonna help you here. Nobody comes to Cedar Grove to help." Jada sat back, rubbing her wrists. Miller didn't know who Uncle Frank was. Frank Morgan wasn't an uncle. He was the special agent in charge of the Chicago DEA Field Division, and Jada had just given him the distress code. The clock was ticking, but for Miller, it was ticking down to an explosion he couldn't see coming. The Cedar Grove courthouse was a relic of the 19th century, all mahogany wood and dust motes dancing in shafts of light. It was meant to inspire awe, but today it felt like a theater for a rigged play. Judge Bennett sat on the bench, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and eroded by bourbon. He didn't look at defendants. He looked through them. Jada stood at the defense table wearing an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. Ms. Lawson stood beside her, shuffling papers, looking ready to lose. Miller sat in the front row, freshly shaved, wearing his dress uniform. He looked the picture of a dedicated public servant. Higgins sat next to him, looking less comfortable, his leg bouncing nervously. "Case number whatever," the bailiff announced. "State versus Tasha Banks. Possession with intent to distribute." "How do you plead?" Judge Bennett grumbled, peering over his spectacles. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Jada said firmly. Miller snorted audibly from the gallery. The judge shot him a look, but it was a friendly one, a co-conspirator's wink. "Miss Banks," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension, "your attorney has informed the court of the plea offer. I suggest you take it. This court does not look kindly on those who waste its time." "I will not plead guilty to a crime I did not commit, Your Honor," Jada replied, her posture perfect, her chin high. "Officer Miller planted that evidence. He stopped me without cause, assaulted me, and fabricated the charges." A murmur went through the courtroom. "You didn't say things like that in Cedar Grove. Not out loud." "Careful, young lady," Judge Bennett warned, his face darkening. "Accusing an officer of the law is a serious matter. Do you have proof?" "I do," Jada said. Miller frowned. He leaned forward. "Proof? What proof could you have?" "Your Honor," the prosecutor, a slick man named Mr. Dalton, stood up. "The defendant is clearly desperate. The evidence is overwhelming. We have the drugs. We have the officer's testimony." "The officer's testimony is a lie," Jada interrupted. "Order!" Judge Bennett slammed his gavel. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt." At that moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. Every head turned. Walking down the center aisle was a man in a sharp charcoal gray suit. He was flanked by 2 other men, also in suits, carrying briefcases. But it wasn't just them. Behind them walked 4 uniformed state troopers. The man in the charcoal suit had silver hair and a gaze that could cut glass. It was Frank Morgan. He didn't stop at the gallery. He walked straight through the bar, right up to the defense table. "Who are you?" Judge Bennett demanded, his gavel hovering in the air. "You can't just barge in here." Frank Morgan stopped. He reached into his jacket pocket. Miller stood up, hand going to his belt instinctively. Morgan pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open. The gold badge inside caught the light, shining brighter than anything else in the room. "Special Agent in charge, Frank Morgan, DEA," he announced, his voice filling the cavernous room. "And I am here to take custody of my agent." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. You could have heard Miller's heart stop. Miller's face went white. He looked at Higgins. Higgins looked like he was about to vomit. "Your agent," Judge Bennett stammered, the granite face crumbling. Morgan turned to Jada. He nodded respectfully. "Agent Thompson, are you all right?" Jada looked at Miller. She smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "I am now, sir." "Agent," Miller whispered. The word felt like ash in his mouth. Morgan turned slowly to face the gallery. He looked at Miller. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of complete and utter dissection. Agent Jada Thompson is a highly decorated federal agent. She is currently the lead operative on a multi-state task force targeting the Sinaloa cartel. Her cover was compromised by a corrupt local stop. "Now wait a minute." Miller stood up, his voice cracking. "I didn't know. She had drugs. We found drugs in her car." "The cocaine you found," Morgan said, using air quotes that felt like knife slashes, "has been tested by our mobile lab outside. It's low-purity street trash." The kind of stuff a low-level dealer cuts with baking soda. Agent Thompson was driving a vehicle seized from a supplier who deals in high purity. If she was moving product, Officer Miller, she wouldn't be moving your product. The courtroom gasped. Furthermore, Jada spoke up, her voice ringing clear. She looked at the bailiff. "Unlock these cuffs now." The bailiff looked at the judge. The judge, pale and sweating, nodded frantically. "Do it! Do it now!" As the cuffs clicked off, Jada rubbed her wrists. She reached into her jumpsuit, which she had been allowed to keep on over her undergarments, and ripped the seam of her bra. She pulled out a tiny black micro SD card. "I wasn't just driving, Miller," Jada said, walking towards the wooden railing that separated them. "I was working. My wire was running. But not the one you searched for. This one." She held up the chip. "It has battery life. It records audio in high definition. It recorded you telling your partner you smelled marijuana before you even approached the car. It recorded you kicking me. It recorded the sound of you opening the trunk, finding nothing, and then the distinct silence before you found the drugs in the back seat." Miller slumped back into the bench. His legs gave out. "But that's not the best part." Jada continued, relentless. "It recorded you talking to Higgins in the front seat while you drove me here. You talked about the money, the Christmas bonus. You talked about how you've done this before. You mentioned a Mr. Patterson who buys the seized cars at auction for cheap and kicks back a percentage to you." The prosecutor, Mr. Dalton, was frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges." "Dismissed," Judge Bennett shouted, banging the gavel so hard the head flew off. "Case dismissed." "Not so fast," Morgan boomed. He signaled to the state troopers standing at the back. "We aren't done here. This is no longer a traffic violation case. This is a federal investigation into police corruption, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics." Morgan pointed a finger at Miller. "Officer Roy Miller, you are under arrest." Miller looked around wildly. "You can't do this. I'm the law in this town." "Not anymore," Jada said, standing right in front of him now. She looked down at him, the power dynamic completely reversed. "Kyle Higgins," Jada said, looking at the rookie. Higgins was crying, actual tears streaming down his face. "You have a choice, Kyle. Right now. You can be a co-conspirator or you can be a witness. Did Miller plant those drugs?" Higgins looked at Miller. He looked at the federal agents. He looked at the prison sentence hanging over his head. "Yes," Higgins sobbed. "He did it. He had it in his vest. He told me to keep quiet. I didn't want to, I swear." "Shut up, Kyle!" Miller roared, lunging at his partner. 2 state troopers tackled Miller before he could move 2 feet. They slammed him face first into the courtroom floor, the same floor where innocent people had begged for mercy for years. "Get off me!" Miller screamed, thrashing. "I know people. I know the mayor." Jada walked over. She crouched down next to Miller's face, pressed against the dusty carpet. "You know what the funny thing is, Miller?" she whispered. "If you had just given me a speeding ticket, I would have paid it. I would have driven away. You could have kept being a king in your little castle." She stood up, watching as they hauled him to his feet and slapped the cuffs on him tight. "But you got greedy and now you're going to lose everything." The troopers dragged Miller out, his screams echoing down the hallway. Jada turned back to Judge Bennett. The judge was trembling, trying to hide behind his bench. "And, Your Honor," Morgan said, stepping up to the bench, "we'll be needing all your court records for cases involving Officer Miller. I suggest you don't lose any of them." Jada took a deep breath. The air in the courtroom still smelled of dust, but the despair was gone. It smelled like rain. It smelled like a clean slate. "Let's go, Uncle Frank," Jada said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I have a car to pick up, and I think it needs a wash." The transition from defendant to commander was instantaneous. Jada stood in the center of the Cedar Grove Police Department bullpen, but the atmosphere had shifted tectonically. Not long ago, she had been dragged through these doors in handcuffs, sneered at by the desk sergeant, and treated like cattle. Now, the bullpen was swarming with federal agents. The acronyms on the backs of the raid jackets, DEA, FBI, DOJ, spelled out the end of the Cedar Grove PD as they knew it. Jada had changed out of the orange jumpsuit and back into her own clothes, salvaged from the mud. Her suit was ruined, stained with clay and grease, but she wore it like battle armor. She stood by the coffee machine, watching a team of forensic accountants dismantle the desk sergeant's computer. "Agent Thompson." Frank Morgan's voice cut through the noise. He walked over, holding a thick ledger. "You need to see this." Jada took the book. It was an old-school handwritten ledger found in a floor safe beneath Officer Miller's locker. "What am I looking at?" Jada asked, flipping the pages. "Civil forfeiture logs," Morgan said, his voice grim. "But these are off the books." Jada ran her finger down the column. There were entries. Vehicles seized, sold for low amounts to Patterson Towing, cash in vehicles split among them. There were dozens of entries, names, dollar amounts. "It's a shopping list," Jada whispered, a cold fury rising in her chest. "They weren't patrolling. They were shopping." "Exactly," Morgan nodded. "They targeted out-of-state plates, rentals, and minority drivers. People they thought wouldn't fight back. People who couldn't afford a lawyer to stay in town to contest the seizure." "Where is Chief Whitaker?" Jada asked, closing the book with a snap. "In his office." Morgan gestured to the glass-walled office at the back of the room. "He's claiming ignorance. Says Miller and Higgins were rogue elements." Jada scoffed. "Rogue elements don't run an operation this clean for years without the boss getting a cut." She marched towards the chief's office. 2 FBI agents were guarding the door. They stepped aside as Jada approached. Inside, Chief Bob Whitaker sat behind his massive oak desk. He was a man who looked like he had been built out of dough, soft, pale, and sweating profusely. His walls were lined with awards. Rotary Club Man of the Year, Safe City Award. "Agent Thompson," Whitaker stammered, standing up halfway before sinking back into his chair. "This is a terrible misunderstanding. I am just as shocked as you are about Officer Miller's conduct." "Sit down, Bob," Jada said, her voice slicing through his bluster. She didn't sit. She leaned over his desk, placing her hands on the polished wood. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for the rest of the cancer." Miller was the muscle. Higgins was the lackey. But someone had to sign off on the paperwork. Someone had to authorize the transfers to the auction house. "I sign hundreds of forms a week," Whitaker protested, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "I can't check every single ticket." "Stop lying," Jada said quietly. "We have the ledger." Whitaker froze. The handkerchief stopped mid-wipe. "We found the ledger in Miller's locker," Jada lied. They hadn't found the chief's connection yet, but she needed him to break. "He wrote it all down, Bob. Every kickback, every envelope he left in your desk drawer." It was a bluff, a classic interrogation tactic. But Whitaker didn't know that. He only knew that Miller was a greedy, sloppy man who likely would keep records to leverage against his boss. Whitaker's face went from pale to gray. "Roy Miller is a liar," Whitaker hissed. "He's trying to drag me down with him." "Then give us the real target," Jada pressed. "The cars go to Patterson Towing, we know that. Who moves the cash?" Whitaker stared at her. He looked at the FBI agents outside his door. He realized his pension, his reputation, his freedom. It was all gone. "It's not just the cash," Whitaker whispered. his voice trembling. "It's the land." "What land?" "Patterson," Whitaker admitted, defeated. "Greg Patterson. He owns the impound lot, but he also sits on the city's zoning board. They seize the cars. They bankrupt the drivers with legal fees. And if the drivers are local, Patterson buys their property when they go under. Miller provides the arrests. Patterson provides the liquidation." I just looked the other way. Jada straightened up. It was worse than she thought. It wasn't just highway robbery. It was a systematic dismantling of the community's wealth. "You didn't look the other way, Bob," Jada said coldly. "You held the door open." She turned to the agents at the door. "Cuff him." As Whitaker began to weep, protesting his cooperation, Jada walked out of the office. She found Morgan waiting. "We have a problem," Jada said. "Whitaker gave up the partner, Greg Patterson. He runs the tow yard and the impound lot on the edge of town." "Let's go pay him a visit," Morgan said, reaching for his radio. "No," Jada shook her head. "If Patterson sees a convoy of black SUVs coming, he'll burn the evidence. He's a businessman. He'll have a shredder and an incinerator." "What do you propose?" Morgan asked. Jada looked down at her muddy clothes. She looked at the keys to the rental Mercedes that Miller had confiscated, which the FBI had just retrieved from the evidence locker. "Miller seized my car," Jada said, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "By law, it should have been towed to the impound lot immediately. If Patterson works the way I think he does, he's probably already stripping it or prepping it for auction, assuming I'm rotting in a cell." "You want to go in there alone?" Morgan asked, frowning. "Not alone," Jada smiled. "I want to go in as Tasha Banks, the scared girl who just made bail and wants her car back." Morgan hesitated. "It's risky, Jada. We don't know how many guys he has there." "I'm a DEA agent, Frank. Risky as Tuesday." She checked the concealed holster at the small of her back. "Give me a head start, then bring the hammer." The Patterson Towing and Salvage Yard was a sprawling graveyard of rust and chrome located outside of town limits. High chain-link fences topped with razor wire surrounded acres of crushed vehicles. A large corrugated metal warehouse sat in the center, smoke billowing from a chimney stack. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground a swamp of oil and mud. Jada took a taxi to the front gate. She looked the part of a woman who had been through hell. Hair messy, clothes stained, eyes red-rimmed, a little makeup trick. She walked up to the intercom. "Yeah," a distorted voice crackled. "I'm here for my car," Jada said, injecting a tremor into her voice. "Officer Miller sent me. He said I could get my personal items." There was a long pause, then the buzz of the electric lock. The heavy gates slid open. Jada walked in. The yard was eerie. Stacks of cars formed towering canyons. In the distance, she heard the screech of metal on metal, a car crusher at work. She walked towards the main warehouse. The sliding door was open. Inside, it looked less like a mechanic's shop and more like a chop shop. High-end vehicles were in various stages of disassembly. A Porsche Cayenne was being stripped of its doors. A BMW M5 was missing its engine. And there in the center bay was her black Mercedes. Standing next to it was a man who looked like a bear shaving for a wedding. Greg Patterson was massive, wearing clean blue coveralls with his name stitched on the pocket. He was wiping his hands on a rag, inspecting the leather seats of her car. 2 other mechanics were working nearby, but they moved with the alertness of hired muscle, not repairmen. Bulges under their shirts suggested they were armed. "Mr. Patterson," Jada called out, stepping into the light. Patterson looked up. His eyes were cold, calculating beads in a fleshy face. He didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed. "We're closed, lady." "I'm Tasha Banks," Jada said, walking closer, keeping her hands visible. "The police, they let me go. Officer Miller said I could come get my suitcase from the trunk." Patterson stopped wiping his hands. He tossed the rag onto the hood of her Mercedes. "Miller," Patterson muttered. "Miller's an idiot. I told him not to send people here." He walked around the car, sizing her up. "You made bail fast for a drug charge." "It was a mistake," Jada said. "My uncle cleared it up. I just want my things and I'll leave." Patterson laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "See, that's the problem, Tasha. The car is already processed. Civil seizure. It belongs to the county now, which means it belongs to me." "My clothes aren't county property," Jada insisted, taking another step forward. She needed to get him talking. She needed him to admit the scheme while the backup wire in her bra was recording. "Everything in the car is evidence," Patterson said, crossing his massive arms. "And besides, Miller called me not long ago from the station." Jada's heart skipped a beat. She kept her face neutral. "Did he?" "Yeah." Patterson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Except he didn't say he was sending you. He was screaming. Something about feds. Something about a setup." Patterson reached behind a tool bench and pulled out a heavy wrench. The two mechanics dropped their tools and reached for their waistbands, revealing 9mm pistols. "You ain't a drug dealer," Patterson said, stepping closer. "Dealers don't walk into the lion's den alone. You're the Fed." The pretense dropped. Jada's posture shifted instantly. The scared victim vanished. The tactical operator appeared. "Federal agent!" Jada shouted, her hand flying to her waist. She drew her service weapon, a Glock 19, in a blur of motion. "Drop the weapons now." The mechanics hesitated. Patterson didn't. He hurled the wrench at her head with terrifying speed. Jada ducked, the heavy steel clanging against a metal pillar behind her. In the split second of distraction, the mechanic on the left raised his gun. Bang! Jada fired once. The mechanic's shoulder exploded in red. He dropped his gun, spinning to the ground, screaming. "Cover!" Jada yelled, diving behind the engine block of the dismantled BMW. Bullets sparked against the concrete floor where she had just been standing. The second mechanic was firing wildly. Patterson had scrambled behind a stack of tires. "Kill her!" Patterson roared. "You kill her or we all go to jail for life." Jada pressed her back against the cold metal of the car. She was pinned. Two hostiles remaining, one with a gun. One massive man who knew the terrain. "Patterson!" Jada shouted over the ringing in her ears. "The place is surrounded. Give it up. I got millions in cash in the floor safe." Patterson yelled back, his voice echoing in the cavernous shed. "I ain't walking away from that for a cop badge." He had just confessed to the scale of the operation. The mechanic flanked right, trying to get an angle on her. Jada saw his shadow stretch across the oily floor before she saw him. She waited. One breath, two breaths. As the mechanic popped out, Jada rolled out from cover, firing two controlled shots to his center mass. He crumpled instantly, but she had exposed herself. Patterson charged. For a big man, he moved with frightening speed. He wasn't using a gun. He was using a crowbar he'd grabbed from a workbench. He swung it like a baseball bat. Jada didn't have time to aim. She raised her arms to block the crowbar smashing into her forearms. The pain was blinding. Her gun skittered across the floor, sliding under a lift. She was disarmed. Patterson loomed over her, raising the crowbar for a killing blow. "You should have stayed in the cell," he spat. Jada gritted her teeth against the pain in her arms. She dropped her center of gravity. As Patterson swung, she didn't retreat. She stepped in. It was a Krav Maga move. She closed the distance, neutralized the reach advantage. She drove her palm into his chin, snapping his head back. Before he could recover, she drove her knee into his groin with the force of a pile driver. Patterson groaned, the crowbar clattering to the ground as he doubled over. But he was strong. He grabbed her by the throat with one massive hand, lifting her off her feet. He squeezed, cutting off her air. "Die!" He spat, his face purple with rage. Jada's vision began to spot. She clawed at his hand, but it was like iron. She looked around. The car lift. Her legs were dangling. She swung them, gaining momentum. She wrapped her legs around his torso and threw her weight backward. Taken off balance, Patterson stumbled back. He slammed hard against the control panel of the hydraulic lift. Crunch. The lift mechanism engaged. The Porsche, suspended above them, shuddered. Jada released her grip and dropped to the floor, rolling away. "What?" Patterson looked up. The hydraulics failed or were released. The two-ton chassis of the Porsche dropped, catching Patterson's jacket and pinning him against the workbench. He wasn't crushed, but he was trapped, the metal frame locking him in place like a medieval vice. "Ah, get it off!" Patterson screamed, thrashing uselessly against the weight of the German engineering. Jada stood up, gasping for air, rubbing her bruised throat. She walked over to her gun, picked it up, and checked the chamber. She walked back to Patterson. He was pinned, helpless, the fight gone out of him. "Greg Patterson," Jada rasped, her voice hoarse. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and being a colossal idiot." Outside, the wail of sirens finally pierced the air. Tires screeched on the gravel. "Took you long enough," Jada muttered to herself. She leaned against her Mercedes, the car that had started it all. She looked at Patterson. "By the way," she said, leaning in close, "that civil forfeiture law you love so much, it works both ways. We're seizing this entire lot, the cars, the land, and that cash you shouted about." Patterson squeezed his eyes shut. The cavalry arrived. Frank Morgan burst through the door, weapon drawn, followed by a SWAT team. They saw the bodies, the trapped boss, and Jada leaning casually against her car. Morgan lowered his gun, looking at the scene. "You said a head start," Morgan said, shaking his head. "Traffic was bad. You okay?" "I will be," Jada said, looking at the Mercedes. "But I think I'm going to need a new rental. This one has blood on the hood." The federal courthouse in Atlanta was a fortress of glass and stone, a stark contrast to the rotting wood and peeling paint of the Cedar Grove precinct. The venue change had been granted immediately. There was no way an impartial jury could be found within miles of Cedar Grove. The story had ceased to be local gossip. It was now a national firestorm. The Cedar Grove Four, Officer Roy Miller, Officer Kyle Higgins, Chief Bob Whitaker, and salvage magnate Greg Patterson sat at the defense table. They looked like a tableau of defeat. Gone were the uniforms, the expensive suits, and the swagger. They wore standard-issue federal detention jumpsuits, their wrists shackled to the table bolts. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The gallery was a sea of reporters, federal agents, and most importantly, the victims of Cedar Grove. They sat in the back rows, a silent jury of the wronged, watching the men who had stolen their livelihoods. Jada Thompson sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution. She was no longer Tasha Banks. She was Special Agent Jada Thompson, dressed in her formal DEA dress blues, the gold badge gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. Beside her sat Frank Morgan, his face grim and satisfied. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Ross, a prosecutor known for dismantling organized crime syndicates, paced before the jury box. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ross began, his voice echoing in the hush. We often trust the badge blindly. We assume that the lights in the rearview mirror are there to protect us. But in Cedar Grove, the badge was not a shield. It was a weapon. And the siren was not a warning. It was a dinner bell for predators. The trial was a slow and agonizing dissection of a long-running conspiracy. The evidence was insurmountable. The prosecution played the tapes from Jada's wire over and over again. The jury heard the wet crunch of Miller kicking Jada against the car. They heard the distinct, chilling sound of him planting the drugs. They heard the laughter, the casual, arrogant laughter of men who believed they were gods. But the most damaging testimony didn't come from Jada. It came from the inside. Kyle Higgins, the rookie, had cracked. In exchange for a leniency recommendation, he took the stand against his mentor. "He told me it was the tax," Higgins whispered into the microphone, refusing to look at Miller. "Roy said that if they were driving a nice car through our town, they could afford to pay the tax. If they fought it, we buried them. If they paid, we let them walk." "And the drugs?" Ross asked. "Roy carried a drop kit in his vest," Higgins admitted, tears leaking from his eyes. "Baking soda mixed with lidocaine, just enough to test positive for cocaine in a field kit. He used it whenever we needed probable cause to seize the vehicle." At the defense table, Roy Miller turned a shade of purple so deep it looked painful. He lunged against his restraints, hissing, "You traitor! You little rat! Order!" Judge Rebecca Hayes slammed her gavel, her eyes flashing fire. "Mr. Miller, one more outburst and I will have you gagged. Do you understand me?" Miller slumped back, defeated. The blue wall of silence hadn't just cracked. It had shattered into dust. Then came the victims. This was the part that turned the jury's objective duty into righteous anger. Tom Reynolds, a weather-beaten carpenter, took the stand. He described how Miller had pulled him over for a muddy license plate. "They took my truck," Reynolds said, his voice trembling. "My tools were in the back. 30 years of tools. They said they found traces of meth on the dashboard. I've never touched a drug in my life. By the time the lab results came back clean, Patterson had already sold the truck for scrap and bought my foreclosure. I lost my house, my job, everything." A woman named Mary Collins testified next. She had been driving her sick mother to a specialist in the city. Miller had seized her car because she had cash in an envelope, her mother's surgery money. They called it drug proceeds. Her mother missed the appointment. Her condition worsened. She died soon after. "He smiled," Mary said, pointing a shaking finger at Miller. "When he took the money, he smiled and told me to have a nice walk." The jury couldn't look at the defendants. The disgust in the room was palpable. A heavy, suffocating blanket. Closing arguments were brief. The defense attorneys looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. There was no defending this. There was only damage control, and the damage was total. The verdict arrived. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Roy Miller, guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, perjury, wire fraud. We find the defendant, Bob Whitaker, guilty. We find the defendant, Greg Patterson, guilty. We find the defendant, Kyle Higgins, guilty." The sentencing hearing was the final hammer blow. Judge Rebecca Hayes was known for being fair, but she had zero tolerance for the abuse of power. She started with Kyle Higgins. "Mr. Higgins, you were young and you were influenced by a corrupt mentor. However, you wore the uniform. You had a duty to intervene. Instead, you held the flashlight while he planted the evidence. I sentence you to years in federal prison." Higgins put his head in his hands and wept. Then she turned to Chief Bob Whitaker. "You were the architect of a system that monetized justice. You turned a police department into a highway robbery crew. I sentence you to 20 years. Then Greg Patterson. You, sir, are a vulture. You fed on the carcasses of the lives these officers destroyed. I sentence you to 25 years. Furthermore, the court orders the immediate forfeiture of all your assets, the tow yard, the real estate portfolio, and your personal accounts. Finally, Judge Hayes turned her gaze to Roy Miller. Miller tried to stand tall, but he looked small, shriveled by the weight of the inevitable. Mr. Miller, Hayes said, her voice icy, you are the nightmare every citizen fears. You took an oath to protect the weak, and instead you hunted them. You are not a police officer. You are a criminal disguised as one. And you picked the wrong driver. She leaned forward. I sentence you to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will die in a cage, Mr. Miller. Take him away. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was the sweetest sound Jada had ever heard. As the marshals dragged Miller away, he looked back at the gallery. He locked eyes with Jada. There was no hatred left in his eyes, only a profound, terrifying realization of his own irrelevance. He was gone, erased. Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded. The rain had cleared, leaving a bright, sharp Georgia afternoon. So, Frank Morgan said, loosening his tie as they walked down the marble steps. How does it feel? It feels finished, Jada said. She took a deep breath of the fresh air. You know the best part? Morgan asked, handing her a file folder. The restitution fund. Jada opened the folder. It was a breakdown of Patterson's seized assets. The court approved it. Every dime from Patterson's empire is going back to the victims. Tom Reynolds is getting enough to buy a new truck, new tools, and a new house. Mary Collins is getting her mother's medical costs back, plus damages. Cedar Grove is getting a reboot. Jada smiled, running her hand over the paperwork. It wasn't just punishment. It was repair. What about the department? Jada asked. Dissolved, Morgan said. The county sheriff is taking over jurisdiction until they can build a new force from the ground up. New recruits, body cameras, federal oversight. The cancer is cut out, Jada. They reached the curb where a black government SUV waited. Jada paused, looking back at the courthouse. She thought about the night in the rain, the fear she had felt. Not for herself, but for the people who didn't have a badge sewn into their lining. You could have just told them, you know, Morgan said softly, echoing a thought he'd had many times. Flash the credential, saved yourself the trauma. If I had flashed the badge, Jada said, her voice steady, Miller would have apologized. He would have let me go, and he would be out on that highway stopping someone else. Someone's daughter, someone's father, someone who couldn't fight back. She looked at Morgan, her eyes clear. I didn't do it for me, Uncle Frank. I did it so there wouldn't be a next time. Morgan nodded, a look of immense respect on his face. He opened the car door for her. You're a hell of an agent, Thompson. Now get in. We have a briefing on the Sinaloa movement. Jada laughed, the tension finally releasing from her shoulders. Can we at least stop for a burger first? I'm starving. Steak, Morgan corrected, on the bureau, as the SUV pulled away. Merging into the Atlanta traffic, Jada watched the courthouse fade in the rearview mirror. Cedar Grove was safe. The bad guys were gone, and somewhere a carpenter was buying a new set of tools, and a grieving daughter was finally getting some peace. The storm was over. Jada Thompson checked her watch, shifted her mindset back to the cartel case, and prepared for the next fight, because in her line of work, there was always another storm coming. But she would be ready, and that is the story of how two corrupt cops picked the wrong driver and lost everything. It's a reminder that authority without accountability is just tyranny, and that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who will bring your whole world crashing down. This story was inspired by true events of undercover operations exposing civil forfeiture abuse. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more stories about karma hitting back hard, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done if you were Jada? Would you have revealed your badge early or waited to catch them in the act? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and stay safe out there. In the end, what happened on that rainy night in Cedar Grove wasn't just about one brave DEA agent taking down corrupt cops. It was a powerful reminder that real courage often looks like staying silent when every instinct tells you to speak up. Jada Thompson could have flashed her badge the moment those officers pulled her over. She could have ended the nightmare right there and walked away safe. Instead, she chose the harder path. She let them dig their own graves because she knew that if she didn't, the next innocent driver, someone's daughter, someone's father, someone without a badge hidden in their clothes, would suffer the same injustice. That kind of quiet strength, the willingness to endure pain for the greater good, is rare and deeply moving. It teaches us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is hold our truth close, wait for the right moment, and trust that justice has a way of finding the light. No matter how untouchable someone seems, greed and cruelty always leave cracks. And when good people refuse to look away, those cracks become the very thing that brings the whole corrupt system crashing down. Jada didn't just win her freedom that day. She restored hope for an entire community and proved that one person's courage can rewrite someone else's future. If this story touched something deep inside you, drop a comment below and tell me. Would you have revealed your badge right away? Or would you have done what Jada did and waited to catch them in the act? I read every single comment, and your thoughts truly matter. If you believe in stories that celebrate real justice and quiet heroes, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next powerful tale of karma, courage, and accountability. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay safe, and never underestimate the quiet ones.